It's good to be with everyone. This is kind of a two-part series. I asked Ari to give me 4 hours for it, but he said no. So if you find I'm talking very fast, it's because we've got this double load. But I'll deal mainly with the Black Panthers because they're less known, and I'm sure many of you have some sort of knowledge of the Beta Israel, so that section will be a little later. The series is taking to the streets. Israel is a very involved society. Taking to the streets happens all the time. And for those of you who saw the wonderful program on Yerucham, there was a mention to Beta Israel and their protests. Their protests, by the way, were very quiet. The ones that we're seeing this afternoon are of a different nature, much more vocal, and in some cases more violent. Just in terms of, for those of you who don't know me, I have a whole lot of writing and information on each slide. And the idea is that, if you're really interested and you want to go later when you get the final version a few days after my presentation, then, the additional information is there as well. So that's why I don't cover everything that appears on any of the PowerPoints. So let's go back to the early days of the state of Israel. And here we see that it was really very, very tough. This whole question of discrimination is an important topic, and I've been dealing with it for a long time. And I do want to say that, we have to be careful in dividing the two terms. One is discrimination, which there was, and I'll mention that. And the other is that when a country is in a very, very difficult situation, by definition, they're going to be the haves and the have-nots. And the Mizrahim, the people from North African countries, sometimes called Sephardi-Mizrahi, they really came in later after the Ashkenazi. And so in the division in Israel between the Sephardi and the Ashkenazi, the Sephardi, I'm using the term Sephardi and Mizrahim to mean the same group, which they're not fully, but accept that. The groups who came later always had it in tougher until, however, 1967, when I arrived. And then, although we were a recent immigrant group, we were called the Anglos, many of us from the Western world, and we had it great. We were received very, very well. That was not the case of the people who we are studying at the moment, the Mizrahim. So the situation in the country in the early days was extremely tough, limited facilities, many people coming in. The country doubles its population in 3 years. The knowledge of the Ashkenazi elite, the government of Mizrahim, was very, very limited. Hardly any of them had met someone from North Africa. And I imagine that part of what developed as discrimination was really, in some cases, not pure discrimination, but really just not understanding who these people are. So what happened? They came in, there were mass of immigrants coming in, not only, by the way, the Mizrahim, but also a considerable number of Holocaust survivors, almost 250,000 people coming in, mainly from European countries. They were placed in immigrant camps, and things were so bad in the early days that some of them even wrote to their relatives abroad, the relatives don't come because where you might have been in your own country, in Morocco, Tunisia, or Egypt, or wherever it is, you're going to find yourself in terrible conditions. And shall we see something that existed in the early years, tent cities. A little later, we see it became sort of these tin shacks. In the middle of summer, it was absolutely awful. Here we see mass groups of Mizrahim in these 10 cities. And here we see a very difficult story that DDT was used to clean children's hair, because at those days it was believed it would work. Afterwards, we found out it's absolutely horrible what happened. So quite quickly, there's tensions developing. These people are coming in. Remember, many of them are coming from middle-class backgrounds, although the Ashkenazim didn't really quite understand that that is also part of the Arab world. And quite soon, we find that there were hunger strikes, there were harsh conflicts with the police, comment about the police. Many of the regular policemen were themselves Mizrahim. So you can imagine this is already beginning to be a double level of complication. And for those of you who are interested in this topic, there's not all that much material, serious academic material in English, but fortunately we have a translation of Shalom Shitritz's book, which is outstanding. So the 50s and 60s, to take some other components of what was going on. Kiryat Shmona, up in the north of the country, workers were unpaid. Salaries, by the way, were very, very low and unpaid, and they set fire to the labor office. We see here in 1959, Wadi al-Salib, which is a part of Haifa, very poorly developed part of Haifa. And here we see there was a demonstration which became violent in Haifa area. And here we see some pictures of the what it looked like, pretty deserted. This is a picture taken many years afterwards. And the Wadi Salib led to tensions, demonstrations, arrests, and terminology, and the terminology is important. They were described as hooligans and criminals. 1962, the education system made a decision which turned out to be problematic, and that is that there were two tracks, academic and vocational, and by definition, the new immigrants were kind of pushed into the vocational level, the blue-collared workers, whereas if you were an older person, or if you came, as I did in 1967, you were obviously put into the better track. I wasn't at school, but people who were at school levels. Six-Day War was an interesting period. There'd been a economic crisis for a number of years before the Six-Day War. The war, as often happens with wars, brought about an artificial economic boom. And the money didn't go all the way down. That means money was coming into the country. There was growth, but the growth only happened in the middle class and richer groups. And then money came from the United Jewish Appeal, generous donors from the Western world. And once again, the reality was that the money went into certain realms of society and didn't get to the development town, those very lonely, poorly developed outlying small towns and villages where many of the Mizrahim found themselves. In addition, by the way, when you look at migratory trends, if a migrant comes into a country and has a group in that country which is well settled, that group tends to bring the migrant into their environment. The Mizrahim didn't have that powerful middle-class group here already, and so they were sort of pushed onto the sidelines of society. We find in the 50s and 60s, of the 60% of the poorest 20% were Mizrahim. So we go down to the last two groups, last 20% of the last groups, and they were essentially filled by the Mizrahim. So we can understand that as we move into the 1970s, we're seeing a society which is struggling. The divisions between the various groups had already existed. By the way, we're not even mentioning the Arab society, because basically the Jewish society looked at itself, within itself, and in many cases were not aware that the Arabs also were obviously going through crisis. The Black Panther organization, which in itself was an unusual organization. It wasn't the regular political party. They essentially came about as a result of, they lived in the Musrara area. The map here gives some sort of sense. This, my mouse here is going along the border between West Jerusalem under Israeli control and East Jerusalem under Jordanian control. Now, who really wanted to live in a border area? The people who found themselves in the border area, and Musrara was one of them, were those people who really were pushed there because that was the accommodation available. And Musrara was one of the several suburbs of Jerusalem which had previously been an Arab Palestinian area, but as a result of the war, they had left and the houses were empty. So with a mass group of immigrants coming into the country, what the authorities did, wherever there was some available accommodation, and things were pretty chaotic, they pushed the people into those areas. And here we see Mizrahi over here, very, very lonely, very close to the border. And although this picture looks kind of okay, what we don't really realize is what was life within the groups. By the way, I know the Mizrahi area very well. My wife and I, Brenda, when we were students, we lived 10 minutes walk from Mizrahi when we were in some student dorms. So what did the Mizrahi represent? And here we're talking essentially about socioeconomic issues. The residents lived in dilapidated kind of situations, frequently lacking a kitchen, a toilet, or a shower. The housing the housing density, which is normally in Jerusalem at that time 1.4 people per room, were 2.5. A third of the family heads were unemployed. And of those employed, 75% were unskilled, low-wage jobs, which is twice the national rate. So when we look at the Black Panthers, we look essentially at families in crisis. The parents often didn't have jobs. Excuse me. The parents often didn't have jobs, didn't have money, and the children were, if they were in schools, but they weren't all, were already having serious social problems. If we look at the adolescents between 14 and 17, only 56% attended a regular structure. And that was because the school leaving examinations, the whole school system, and we know this from various periods in American history as well, were based on questions which were very suitable for Ashkenazi. So you have this imbalance when they were going through the examinations. Added to all these issues was that German reparation money came in the early 1960s, and Holocaust survivors got money. And so we have a middle-class group, and then we have survivors who were receiving fairly considerable amounts of money. And what we have to understand about the Mizrahim, particularly the Mizrahim living in these kind of areas like Mizrahi, they were clearly feeling that they were totally left behind. And therefore, this is really the start of the Black Panther movement. By the way, this is the 50th anniversary of the Black Panther movement. So in Israel today, there are various exhibitions and art galleries are bringing in pictures of them. And someone asked last week, when we spoke about German reparations, are these issues part of discussion in Israel? And the answer with the German reparations, yes, discussed. And certainly, as we can understand by the exhibits around the country, that the Black Panthers issue is being discussed again and again. Now, what the Black Panthers, the people in Mizrahi, realized is that not only had earlier German or Holocaust survivors received reparation money, but for those of us who had arrived in the 70s, the Anglos and later the Russians, there'd been a new immigrants benefits law, which assisted new immigrants in tremendous ways. I know personally the kind of benefits that we got as new immigrants, whereas the Mizrahim who had arrived in the 1950s hadn't received the benefits. At that time, the government was much poorer and there was much less awareness. So they were asking a legitimate question. We've been in Israel all these years, they said of themselves, and yet the newcomers are receiving all these advantages. How did they move into a political realm? This was an unusual phenomenon because the far left must been members. They're kind of very closely connected to some of the radical communist perspectives. They really turned to the Black Panthers, who had almost no idea of how to organize politically. And they developed relationships with the Matzpen. And the problem was that the Matzpen, in a sense, who were almost all Ashkenazi, in a sense exploited the Black Panthers for their own perspective. But what they did, and this is very interesting, some of the Black Panthers who by and large would eventually move to right-wing political parties. Some of them actually were caught up with Matzpen philosophy and became very committed to the Palestinian problem at a time in history where very few Israelis were really concerned about the Palestinians. What they did, as they looked around for a title, they were looking for a similar group which seemed to express oppression. And that's where the name Black Panthers came from. There was another reason, by the way. They used the Black Panthers term to frighten Golda Meir, who we'll be talking about in a moment. Here we see the sign, the Black Panthers in Israel speak. Here we see in this picture a mock funeral showing the lack of consideration of the Ashkenazi establishment to the needs of the Black Panthers. This was quite a large demonstration in the middle of Jerusalem. They had one of their first defined demonstrations was in March 1971, where they demonstrated outside City Hall. That seemed to be the place where they should object. By the way, City Hall is 5 minutes walk from Musrara, so it's not surprising that that's where they want. And the famous Mayor Teddy Kolik moves out of his office window on the second floor and shouts at them, "Get off my grass." Then there was starting the tension. Leaders were arrested and jailed, and things were getting quite tough. I say this not only in the literature I've read, but because we live near to this area, it was very clear that something was happening here. What we didn't understand as new immigrants, by the way, was what was going on. We understood who our enemies were. Suddenly we were living in Israel, and we didn't really kind of quite get that the Israeli population was also going through crisis. And this is really what confused many people. And got some Israelis to support the Black Panthers, and as we see, others to oppose them. In April 1971, they met Prime Minister Golda Meir. And what happened as a result of the meeting had two sides to it. Firstly, Golda Meir decided that there would be a commission of inquiry to deal with youth in distress, and that's clearly who the Black Panthers were. Unfortunately, as a result of the Yom Kippur War in 1973, a considerable amount of the funds that should have been allocated to the youth in distress was actually used to pay for the Yom Kippur War and its implications. The other side of this whole event was a comment. And, you know, comments in history can have a major importance. And what happened here on the radio interview after meeting the Black Panthers, she was asked, you know, Madam Prime Minister, what are you feeling about these people? And she used a very, very condescending expression. They're not nice, by the way, when she said it with the American Hebrew accent. Hem einam yeladim, hem neinam tovim. You know, they're not nice people, with a kind of very, very condescending tone. That really made things terrible. What were their goals? A whole lot of very basic concepts. Not enough work, sleeping 10 in a room, somewhat exaggerated in the big picture. There was definitely those of whom had been taken to jail. Police brutality existed, and definitely we've had enough discrimination. That is what they were really talking about. And they didn't have the ambience to really assist them in dealing with this government. They were not aware of how the government works. They came from different backgrounds. Many of them had left school at young ages. And here they were really very much caught in this difficult situation. Their frustration brought about demonstrations. Sometimes the demonstrations reached 15,000 people. By the way, that's an extremely high figure. We have cases in May, 100 people being arrested. And then came the moment which was shocking. 3 Molotov cocktails. We were in Ben Yehuda Street next to Tara Cafe, famous cafe which no longer exists, in downtown Jerusalem, and a Molotov cocktail went off. You can imagine people like myself, few years in Israel, what's going on? These are the Jewish people who blowing up Molotov cocktails, which are pretty frightening. there was a tremendous amount of tension. Things moved, and the Black Panthers were trying hard to find their place in this unusual kind of world, a world that they didn't have too much understanding of. They were getting pushed on the one hand by the left-wing Matzpen, but it was terminology which really didn't mean anything to them. They tried a number of concepts. One was a Robin Hood style idea of removing milk bottles from the wealthy Rehavia suburbs and giving it to the poor areas. Demonstrations rose with rice price of stable commodities. And we see the picture over here. The Hebrew translation is war on poverty, not on the poor. Theirs was very, very much a social kind of situation, not totally aware of the political situation which existed there. Things changed. There were a whole lot of concepts which some of the people who of Mizrahi background started to ask themselves. Some of them said, a considerable number actually, was it best to go on the route of the Black Panthers? Were demonstrations the best way? Was the Robin Hood kind of concept, stealing milk from one area to give it to the others, was that going to work? And by the 1970s, we found that there's a deep division within the Black Panther group, who had never really become a homogeneous party of any kind. And they went to support the Likud and later in the 1980s, the Shas ultra-Orthodox party. Some of them went for community development as a result of a considerable donation by Nissim Gaon, the president of the World Sephardi Federation. Some of them, by the way, went into academia. We have a considerable number of people of Mizrahi background in all the universities who have done extremely well. Then there was the Mizrahi Democratic Rainbow Coalition, which felt in a very sophisticated way. We see the picture of these people here. Clearly, it looked different from what we had seen earlier. These were people who understood how to work the system. See a picture here of David Levy, and we'll hear about him in a moment. What was the big picture? What really happened with the Black Panthers, and did it succeed? Well, the decision and the pressure by the Matzpen group, which had got some of them, some of the leaders in particular, we'll speak about in a moment, to support the Palestinians, was opposed by most of the Black Panthers. Black Panthers were concerned with themselves. They saw themselves as wanting to be integral members of the Jewish society. And yeah, the Matzpen had kind of moved them, once again, my apologies, to move them into another kind of environment. We have a situation where the people who may have helped them, centrist Sephardi leaders, here I'm using the Sephardi in the terms of people who were originally from Spain, very much an elite group in Israeli society. People like that who really had been part of the political world, many of them, by the way, in the Mapai Labour Party, and even David Levy, who was a member of the Likud party, and to quote what many of them felt, didn't believe Black Panthers could be trusted. Quite often, middle-class Mizrahim weren't comfortable with the Black Panthers. There was a social gap. People who were middle-class, and in many cases, first-generation middle-class, didn't really know what to do with the Black Panthers. They left that world. It might have been their parents' world, but certainly not their own. No recognized political party really supported them. The Likud, to a certain extent, Menachem Begin was interested in them, but not in a pure political realm. And the basic crisis of the Black Panthers, when we look back 50 years, were the serious internal divisions. These three people who we find here were very impressive. Sadio Marciano, Ruben Abergel, and Charlie Biton. These guys, with very little background, no political training on any kind of level, pushed for an extended period of time the claim and the legitimate claim that the Mizrahim had been discriminated against. They hadn't had the advantages which other groups had. The money which had been promised to them hadn't been given. And really, these people, in their way, were quite amazing. The issue came up very recently, 2 years ago, in an amazing TV series, Valley of Tears, about the 1973 Yom Kippur War, which has a very important subtext about the role of the Black Panthers. So the issue is that although we're dealing with an event which seems to be purely an event of the 1970s, we see it comes up even till today. I want to conclude this section on the Black Panthers with what came out a few days ago in the New York Jewish Week. To quote it, many Ashkenazi and Mizrahi Jews in Israel today regard the Black Panthers as violent hooligans whose implosion after only 2 years indicates their lack of popular support. I don't agree with this comment, because I think what the Black Panthers did was they inculcated into Israeli society the need for awareness, although they themselves didn't create a political party, which in Israeli society is the kind of the 101 of trying to ever develop any kind of impact on what's going on. Let's look quickly at the Beta Israel at the Ethiopians. We won't go into the background, but rather talk about the situation from the 1970s. The Beta Israel had been faced by much greater problems than the Mizrahim. The Mizrahim had come into the country and no one had questioned their Judaism. That was not the case with the Beta Israel. The Beta Israel, the House of Israel, were caught between different rabbinic authorities. On the one hand, in 1973, the new chief rabbi, Ovadia Yosef, he ruled that they were in fact Jews. But there were other points of view. We know that the rabbinate of Israel is not a homogeneous group. There are many, many different voices. And there were those rabbis who were rejecting the idea that they were Jews. There were those people who were in the various government ministries who rejected the ideas that were Jews. Things became extremely tough in Ethiopia. And although there'd been a small number of Ethiopians in the country, by the way, some of whom I'd actually taught at the Hebrew University in the early 1970s, and I remember the problems that they found, the different cultural backgrounds that they came from, they heard on the one hand support, Chief Rabbi, and then Yitzhak Rabin and later Menachem Begin on the government side seemed to be supporting the people. In the 1970s, they didn't quite know where they were. They were still a small group, and therefore no one paid too much attention, but the crisis in a certain sense started in the 1980s and 1990s, when a significant number came in the two remarkable events, Operation Moses in 1984 and Operation Solomon in 1991, 8,000 and about 14,000. This already put the Beta Israel into the center of society. Now, like the Mizrahim, like the Black Panthers in particular, they look different. They, many cases, didn't understand Hebrew. They were deeply confused by this Western kind of society, which suddenly they had been pushed into, and were pained by the fact that they who had retained Judaism for all these centuries were not looked at as Jews. They came in this very dramatic event of receiving a Guinness Book of Records prize, in a sense. 1,086 were put onto this one Boeing 747 plane. They took out all the seats, and 2 babies were born. Their arrival was dramatic. And I remember many of them, we were then living in Jerusalem, many of them were brought to a hotel 2 minutes from us. And there was tremendous amount of enthusiasm initially for the Beta Israel, but as soon as it came to living in Israel, it became a different issue. We often have the expression in Israel, Israel likes immigration, but not immigrants. It's not a totally correct kind of comment, but we have to understand Israeli society, which has been an immigrant society, doesn't always know how to deal with immigrants who are different from themselves. And this, I think, was essentially the major problem that the Beta Israel found themselves in. Where did the demonstrations come? The demonstrations came up in 1985, when already the group, they're a considerable group today, they're about 150,000 citizens of the state of Israel. The first was that in 1985, the rabbinate demanded that they would have to go through a conversion. Conversion involved a mikvah and a brit milah, circumcision. This was had with it several other very insulting kind of components. Just to give one of the many, when they went to the Western Wall, an ultra-Orthodox group pushed them away, saying that they couldn't be at the Western Wall because they hadn't been converted. One of the comments, and there was a great deal written about this, someone said, I would rather die than undergo ritual immersion, part of the conversion process. Because although the administration said, what's the big deal? Well, go through a mikveh, you know, and a symbolic brit milah. What are you getting so upset about it? For them, this was unbelievably problematic. This was the first time that they came out on the streets. The second time was 10 years later, when, with the HIV issue, what they didn't know, that their blood was accepted but was thrown away. The fear was that their blood was in fact affected. When I used to speak to the Ethiopian students and Ethiopian colleagues, what they would always say, you cannot imagine what it was when we heard that our blood had been thrown away. From the biblical period, we knew that that was the greatest gift that we could give to our country. They have no other home. This is Eretz Israel, is our country, they would say. And therefore, this second range of stone throwing were people who would shout out, of course I threw rocks, don't you realize they're killing us? And a placard said, remember what Hitler did. These demonstrations reached about 10,000 people, police attacks, and 41 police were injured. Part of the role of the Ethiopian Jews, the Beta Israel demonstrating, was to show that they weren't passive. A stereotype had developed very, very deeply. It said, you know, you can push these Ethiopians around, they won't do anything. They're those quiet people, especially the elder. So this is really, besides anything else, they wanted to become this Israelis in the sense of Israelis object, shout, you know, the sort of a bit of a restless kind of people all in all, and they wanted to be seen in the same way. They realized that the view of a wider Israeli society, that you could push them around, was working against them. As time went by, and it took a long time, 2017, the law was changed and Beta Israel blood donations were accepted. Very, very painful. But what blew up was just 2 years ago, the death of Solomon Teka. The death of Solomon Teka reminded many people, particularly those of us who understand the United States well, or look at what's going on in America. This really did feel very, very much like some of the things that we've seen in the United States. Solomon Teka was not the only Beta Israel person who'd been harmed by the police. The police were very rough with them. The police, I think, were rough through lack of knowledge. Maybe police do often tend to get very rough. Many of the Beta Israel lived in the poor areas, and therefore there was sort of some activity going on there which was problematic for what happens with people who feel very much deprived. But something happened with Solomon Teka, because this seemed to be really something, his killing seemed to be absolutely unaccepted. And this started 3 days of violent nationwide protests,
with tremendous damage to property. I remember the big demonstration in the middle of Tel Aviv. That was violent. I've never seen anything on this kind of level in Israel in the 55 years I've been here. It really was very, very problematic. The Beta Israel was supported to a certain extent by the white groups, but the main people were, and we can see it here in this picture, don't shoot, I'm just a young black. We can see some very, very powerful conflicts between the border police and this young Ethiopian woman. We get here the picture of the mass demonstrations around Solomon Tekke, and the signs say, police kill Beta Israel. By the way, this demonstration was definitely a nationwide protest. On the first day of this particular protest, we were driving, it must have been about an hour and a half away from Tel Aviv, and even as far away as that, the roads were closed. So the Beta Israel had, in a sense, closed down large sections of Israeli society out of a sense that because they're black, they have been discriminated against. What went wrong? And just to take the last two slides. Firstly, this was clear discrimination. If in the case of the Mizrahim, it was there, but it was of a different kind. Here, I think it was much more, the discrimination was much more open, much cruder. The lack of understanding of Beta Israel was amazing. The Israeli army brought me in on a considerable number of occasions to explain to officers who the Beta Israel were. When the Beta Israel were called up for the Israeli army, what they found is that the officers didn't know who they were. This was some sort of strange kind of group, and we obviously understand that an army unit has to work together, and the officers didn't understand. So I was asked to help them really grapple with cultural change, of which one was, just to give one, in Ethiopian society, as you find in many African countries, you don't question or you don't oppose what someone above you has said. I found that at university. That's the same thing with the Kesim, the religious leaders. A young Ethiopian would never question what their religious leader says or what any person somewhere in authority. Now, what happened in the Israeli army when officers asked them, have you, for example, the one case study I remember, have you got water in your canteen? They would think the answer that what they had to say was yes, even if they didn't have the water in the canteen. And the young Israeli officers were trying very, very hard to say, I don't understand them. Are they lying? And I would say they're not lying, but because of their cultural background, where they have to respect you as being the officer, they have to give you an officer which doesn't seem disrespectful. So these were the issues where the cultural differences were unbelievable. Their level of literacy was very low. Literacy in Amharic, their own language, and when they got into Israeli schools, if they weren't fully literate in Amharic, to learn a second language would obviously bring them into a much more marginalized situation. In the year 2002, 47%, a very high percentage between the age of 25 and 34, were not in the labor force. And once again, as we found with the Mizrahim, components of discrimination coming up in different ways. This particular case, in 2016, a rabbi told Israeli women not to immerse the Beta Israel in a mikveh, in the ritual bath, where the attendant was Ethiopian. So the woman had the job, the Ethiopian woman had the job, and then the rabbi told other women from the other groups in society, don't go to that mikveh because the woman who's in charge of cleaning the mikveh is of Ethiopian background. Very, very tough. To conclude on a somewhat more optimistic note, is to to recognize that in the last decade or so, there have been important changes. Firstly, the SIG, the ceremony, the religious ceremony, their most important annual religious ceremony now is respected, and it brings within it a memorial for the 4,000 who perished trying to reach Israel. Very, very tough kind of stories. There at the Mount Herzl in Jerusalem, there's a wonderful, wonderful area. Here we see just a small section of it, where an attempt has been made by Israeli society to explain to the wider population the Beta Israel story. And this is a number of little huts where it's written in language which is very suitable for school children, which tells in each of these huts a little story of someone who was involved in the Beta Israel story. Some sort of attempt, I think, albeit late in the game, to try and explain exactly who the Beta Israel are all about. We've seen some successes. Beauty Queen, minister, a previous minister of immigration, and now she's still within the government, a woman officer in the army, a senior officer, high-level officer, and many of the officers who are Ethiopians are certainly getting ahead within the army. And then that important picture, when we take a group like the Beta Israel with the deep gender issues which exist within them, when some of the young women get into the crack units of the Israeli army, that is going to be important. In addition to which, when one looks at the big picture in Israeli society, I know the numbers don't cover anywhere near a percentage that might be true in some of the other groups in Israel, but we do have them in academia. We have rabbis, a number of important rabbis who had to go through new rabbinic training because their own education, Judaic education, was considered unacceptable. It's quite a complex sub-issue. As we see, army officers, television, definitely a number of them in television business, Knesset members, 4 or 5 normally in the Knesset, actors, musicians, writers, and so on and so forth. The good thing, I think, about the Beta Israel, which one can't say for the Black Panthers, is that I think a significant number of Israelis really felt bad, felt that something was going wrong. There's a significant number of NGOs, Ezra, a English-speaking volunteer organization, ORT, the Hadassah women, all these different groups in Israel are trying to give the Ethiopians a hand. And one can only hope that for those Ethiopians who are going through the present school system, where things are somewhat better understood, I imagine, that what happened to the earlier generation will not happen to them. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'm going to open up the chat feature here so people can chat their questions. And while people are chatting questions, I'll just start with a few notes. So first of all, we hosted Hayudim Ba'im. I don't know if you've ever watched their satire on Israeli TV, but I have 2 segments I will share. They are not politically correct, but they say a lot in tying to what you said. One is about the founders of Israel sitting around a table saying they're now going to admit Mizrahim and people from Africa, and the response that comes, which is, again, not politically correct, but really fits into the discussion. And the second is about the Ethiopians donating blood and what happens behind the scenes. It's kind of like the skit show and very satiric. Number 2, we did a program on Valley of Tears, which if you haven't seen it, I urge you to see it. It is primarily about the 73 war, but it really is built around the start and the characters who are Black Panthers. In fact, in one scene, they talk about stealing the milk and redistributing it. So it ties into today's program. So here are some questions. First of all, last week and then today you started off talking about protests, and they were all in Jerusalem, and suddenly they moved to Tel Aviv. It seems like all the protests today are in Tel Aviv. Why this move?
Well, you know, some of them, the early demonstrations of the Ethiopians were in Jerusalem, and the Black Panthers were in Jerusalem. The Beta Israel, the big last one of the Ethiopians, moved to Tel Aviv because they wanted to. This was a nationwide demonstration. If they'd kept it only in Jerusalem, it would have stayed within the confines of only one city, albeit an important city. By getting to Tel Aviv, they actually thought they could influence the wider society. You know, if you cut off a road between Tel Aviv and Jerusalem, it only the Jerusalemites suffer. But if you cut off the roads around Tel Aviv, you've actually got a tremendous impact. And the 2019 demonstration was kind of after a long period of demonstrations. They were much more sophisticated, and they believed that the only way that they could get their voice heard was to be violent, and violence in the wider Tel Aviv arenas, downtown Tel Aviv, in some of the they cut off traffic in some of the main roads there, was going to be much more effective. So that was really the movement from earlier demonstrations in Jerusalem for a relatively small population to the wider Israeli population. Remember, Tel Aviv people are more likely, Tel Aviv Ashkenazi, Tel Aviv Sephardi people, more middle class, are more likely to kind of get involved with the Beta Israel than some of the religious groups in Jerusalem, who anyway, some of them until today, are very suspicious about their Judaism. So this is really the reason why Tel Aviv became the central arena.
So what happened? You had the, as we could see in what you spoke about, but also in the series Valley of Tears, you had the demonstrations by the Jewish Black Panthers. Then you had the '73 war, and then things fizzled. Why did things fizzle out? Why didn't they continue to protest?
You know, the '73 war had such an unbelievable impact on Israeli society, as we see from, as you mentioned, this excellent series, Valley of Tears, that it took quite a long time in the 70s for Israel to get back into itself. The importance of the Yom Kippur War in 1973 is that it came after the '67 Six-Day War. In 1967, Israelis felt, wow, we're the top of the world, we can do anything we want. Suddenly comes the '73 war, where, you know, we didn't do nearly as well. And then in early 1982, which we'll be dealing with, by the way, next week, we have the first Lebanese war. So I think the impact of the Yom Kippur War, and later even the war in Lebanon in 1982, really distracted Israeli society from itself, and it dealt much more with the external threats, which was going to change, by the way, when we get 2011, when we have the famous cottage cheese demonstrations. So I think what we find in many cases, demonstrations are likely to happen when the society doesn't seem to be particularly threatened. I think that might be one of the reasons.
Today, is the Mizrahi community overrepresented in poverty, or has it succeeded? In other words, do they still need help, and should there be an effort to help them?
They're very, very divided. I'm going to say something which I know sounds condescension. It's sort of condescending, but it's not. There are those Mizrahim who have gained by constantly pushing forward their victimhood. This is a known phenomenon. You sometimes gain by being victims. Many of those people actually in the Knesset, they're very powerful. Someone like Miri Regev, and I could mention 4 or 5 other central politicians, they push the victimhood concept forward all the time, and there is some legitimation in it. I'm not saying it isn't legitimate, but that's where they are. But you have a totally different group of middle-class Mizrahim. Where we live in Israel, for example, it's a good case study, a town of 14,000 people in Even Yehuda. The intermixture of Mizrahim and Ashkenazim is unbelievable. I am not even aware, quite honestly, in looking and speaking to someone, my mind doesn't tell me, think, divide Ashkenazi, Sephardi. So I think that is the story. There are those Mizrahim who perpetuate it, and maybe it's legitimate, I'm not saying it's not, and those who have definitely made it. You find in vast parts of Israeli society how prominent the Mizrahim are. You know, my world has been academia. I can't get over how many are. Now, it's true, you know, we haven't yet had a prime minister who's a Mizrahi person. It's true the High Court, Supreme Court is made up of more Ashkenazi than Sephardim. That is all true. But at the same time, I think the growth of the Mizrahi middle class has been very significant. And many of those people wouldn't even want to see the Black Panther presentation, which you people have seen today. They say that's another generation. That's what our parents had. We're living in another world. So, Ari, my answer would be, depends who you're talking to. And as you travel around the country, as I hope you're going to do in a few months' time, you'll definitely pick up that kind of feeling between Netivot, deep sense of marginalization, very poor, and other areas of Jerusalem where you'll see, you won't even know they're Mizrahim because it's such an integrated kind of situation.
Heidi Meyer and others are saddened so much to hear about this going on in Israel. I don't know if they knew that it was going on. Many of us, if you've been on CSP, you've learned about this because we kind of have spiral learning. So Paul talked about this in another series, but we know about it, and it's obviously in America. It's something we're going through right now. The same thing, and it is painful. So one of the questions by Lenore is how integrated are schools in Israel and in the education system? You know, in America, they're pushing to teach real American history. It's become a political issue here in the United States. I won't go into that detail now. Maybe we'll do a program about critical race theory, but it's become politicized here. And I assume maybe in Israel as well. So how much of this history is taught in Israel so that society can move on and change and do better?
So just one general comment about schools in Israel. Schools in Israel are not divided between Ashkenazi and Sephardi. That isn't really the definition, but rather on a religious level. So they're ultra-Orthodox schools, modern Orthodox schools, and general schools. So if we talk about division in education, it's really on the religious level. Then there are Jewish schools and Arab schools, and there are a handful of mixed Jewish and Arab schools. But in terms of the curriculum and things like that, it includes everything today. I would say one thing about where the Black Panthers were very important, their impact seeped through. It wasn't one of those dramatic changes, but they really did put the Mizrahi issue into the curriculum. You know, Shoah, Holocaust, was always so central, at least after the Eichmann trial, in Israeli curricula, but not many Mizrahim, except in one or two countries in North Africa, had been affected by it. So it really didn't speak to them. As time go by, that's very much changed, you know, and vast numbers of people, you've had some wonderful programs on Moroccan Jews, vast numbers of Israelis have visited Morocco. So, you know, there's this traveling around, people go to Egypt and pick up the Jewish story of Egyptian Jews. So I think this is really kind of improving the situation. You know, I don't think anything is 100% pure, and it's not always totally honest. I personally think the position is better than it used to be, certainly not 100%. I mean, if it was an ideal world, I think 99% of Israel might be a little bit different, but I'd probably make that comment about every country in the world, so don't take it too seriously.
True. By the way, I'm very happy that we have Shep Wachnon with us. I hope I'm pronouncing his name. He was as a teenage American Jew of Moroccan descent. He witnessed the Black Panther protests in Jerusalem 50 years ago this summer, and he's been putting in some notes that you can check out. Let's see. So today, do you find the Israeli community, well, it seems like Israeli leaders are doing their best to bring Jews in from around the world. And the goal was really, you know, they had to just get them to Israel and figure out what to do with them here. And they made some bad decisions. If they had you around back when they were trying to bring people in, they probably wouldn't have broken up families like the way they broke up families. They would, you know, they in other words, they needed to be sensitized to the social fabric of the communities they brought in, which they weren't. One question asked was, when the Russian Jews came in, was the government now, and is the government like focused on these important questions about the communities they're bringing in and how to integrate them into society in a better way? Or did the Russians face similar challenges? And of course, Russians look white, so maybe they benefited from that, or didn't.
Absolutely, absolutely. Russians not only looked white, they were so Ashkenazi. You know, even if they came from non-Ashkenazi parts of the wider Russian Federation. But what happened with the Russians was their number. There were almost 1 million Russian speakers came to Israel. At a certain time, they were about 20% of the country. So you have a group like that coming in, and they were well educated. And there had been earlier Russian speakers here. So, you know, they had this kind of contact. There was an understanding of Israeli society of who the Russians are, because you have them around you, even coming from the earlier period of Natan Sharansky and people like that. So I think the Russians found themselves in a totally different situation. Was there discrimination against the Russians? Yes, but it was a very different kind. The Russians have a very strong accent when they speak Hebrew. So you would hear these Israelis sort of playing on their accents. There was one or two very problematic issues with the Russians. There was a stereotype that, I'm sorry to go into this, but this is the reality, that a considerable number of Russian women were prostitutes. Where did this horrible stereotype come from? It came from the fact that they had women of Eastern European background, not Jewish people, had been brought to Israel for that purpose. And, you know, stereotypes form very, very quickly. And there were a few years where that kind of thing existed. But because of the overall power of the Russian community, and they've got their own political party, Yisrael Beitenu, which now has the Minister of Finance, very powerful Minister of Finance, they found themselves in a totally different situation. So, you know, I think the question's a good question. If you come from a group which is known in a country, and you're a large group, and you have a protecting group which arrived earlier, that by and large is going to make your integration a whole lot easier. By the way, the young Russians have succeeded in unbelievable ways. I mean, hardworking, you know, the whole Russian doctrine, you don't sit around and hope, you know, hope things will work out. You go out. I've known Russians taking on jobs you would never expect them to have wanted to do, knowing what they did in the old country. And they really are a very resilient group of people, which together with the other factors, I think made life a great deal easier for them. But in some development towns, there were tensions. There were tensions between Mizrahim and Russian speakers. But I think it's a lot better. I think the Russians have had it, relatively speaking, easy. By the way, the group that's had it easiest of all are people like myself. Came 1967, you know, the country wanted Anglos. We seemed to be the right kind of people. Little did they know what we really liked. But sure as anything, you know, we were very, very lucky. Other groups have just not had those kind of advantages. By the way, just a silly comment, I was teaching in Hebrew classes at the Hebrew University without knowing any Hebrew. So you can imagine what sort of privilege someone like I got. I was in Kita Gimel, at kind of a very low level of Hebrew. So, but other groups didn't have it. For other immigrant groups, Israel has been very, very tough society.
Lenore asks, going back to the school question, even though you talked about schools being divided between religious and non-religious, and I guess the question is, for the Ethiopian Jews, are they considered religious or not? And are they more religious? That's one question. But the second question is, if they lived in their own neighborhood, didn't have their own separate schools. So in a way, wouldn't that create this separation in society?
The Ethiopian religion is a different religion from Rabbinic Judaism because it's pre-Rabbinic. So this is where the crisis came about. It was a very serious crisis. They saw themselves as religious with their religious authorities, the Kesem, their rabbis. They came to Israel and were not looked at as being religious, which is where the whole problem of the conversion issue came about. So this was very, very difficult for them. They are kind of religiously oriented as a community. I would define it as that. Western Ashkenazi Jews probably wouldn't even understand what my comment is really all about, because it doesn't fit in within the mold of Western Judaism. By the way, Mizrahim are more tolerant towards them. That we definitely know. We found with that program on Beta Israel in Yerucham, the comment came up that Beta Israel interacted better with the Mizrahim than with the Ashkenazim, because you have some levels of commonality. The other point, by the way, of Ethiopian Jews, which is obviously their background, they were living in small villages, very low level of education. I mentioned low level of literacy, and therefore when they came to Israel, it was a double whammy, not knowing Hebrew and not being fully literate in Amharic.
We're going to be finishing up shortly, but I think we have one or two more questions. Let's talk about the army, because the big thing about Israel, and you've taught us this and other teachers as well, is that the army, and we know it happened in US history as well, when you fight together, it breaks down the differences. So has that happened for the Mizrahi Jews? Has that happened for the Ethiopian Jews in Israel? Has the discrimination part kind of overwhelmed that, or has it broken down those barriers?
I think with Mizrahi Jews, there were other avenues of success. Although they were blue-collar people are respected in any society. You need your plumber and your electrician. Without them, you can't survive. So I think in the early years, the Mizrahim had that advantage of an open kind of background. The Beta Israel, the Ethiopians, didn't have that. They didn't have the technical skills which someone growing up in any Middle Eastern country would probably have. So this really made it very difficult. And therefore, the question is very important. Army, for many of them, was the one way of upward mobility. And so therefore, when in the one picture that you saw, the one slide you saw, where you have an army officer who's, I don't know what the translation in English is, Gan Aluf. He has two little falafels on his shoulder there, and they're getting ahead there. And you have those young Ethiopian women in a fighting unit. That is an extremely important component. And yes, it's often one of the places where close relationships were developed. The other realm of close relationship, by the way, were youth movements. When Ethiopians would join a youth movements are still quite strong in Israel. When Ethiopians joined a youth movement, that would develop sort of comfortable relationships. And you see walking around the country, you see, Ethiopians and non-Ethiopians walking together. But some of the areas where the Ethiopians live are very, very problematic. The poor area of Netanya, which is largely Ethiopian, is a depressed area. There's no doubt about it. I say we've got a long way to go. I think these sort of programs that we have here, I kind of sometimes wish we in Israel would be seeing these programs, because, I don't always know if there's a broad enough awareness on some of the issues. But to give the positive side, the Valley of Tears opened up in a remarkable way the crisis of the Black Panther. So if you watch TV, and Israeli TV, I think, is very good, there are mechanisms of wider understanding within Israeli society. But we've got some way to go still.
Final two questions. If you are Ethiopian and you walk into a Haredi neighborhood, will you get a reaction that you wouldn't get if you were a random visitor to the neighborhood who is white?
I imagine so. And not all Haredi areas. By the way, the Haredi are very heterogeneous. But certainly in some Haredi areas, even I going in, even if I had a kippah on my head, some of them would really wonder exactly what I'm doing there, But yes, in some areas, that kind of discrimination exists. By the way, it's another topic, but I must bring it up. in the Haredi society, there's certain tensions until today between the Ashkenazi and the Sephardim. So you have within the Haredis, just to give an example, Ashkenazi Haredi schools are quite reluctant to accept Sephardi young women into their school system. Just to give you one case, there are many other cases. So if that's happening within the Haredi community, how much more so when you're talking about someone who's obviously so much of an outsider, like a Beta Israel Ethiopian Jew. So the concept of we're a country of tribes, I think resonates correctly until today.
I will share, many of you about last October joined us for our virtual tour to Israel, and we met with an individual named Naftali Aklum, who is one of these people that came over. I don't know whether it was Operation Solomon, Operation Moses, and he has a lot to say about issues today. So I would say certainly Ethiopian Jewish community in Israel has challenges, and I'll share that link from Naftali Aklum's video recording and our live talk with him. And I'm hoping we'll meet with him when we go to Israel as well. So my final question is, in America, we talk about, and we have blatant, we have systematic blatant racism in our country, and we're trying to deal with it, and hopefully we'll get there someday soon. But they're talking about reparations. It's very different in how Jews got to Israel from Ethiopia than how Black people got to the United States. So, but is there discussion about reparations in Israel to help lower level of society that face discrimination or faces discrimination?
Yeah. There are programs, there are definitely programs. Let me just give you one example. Many years ago, it was realized that until you have a certain percentage of a community which is university educated, that community will not get ahead. And therefore, in the 1970s, a pre-academic year at universities was developed exactly for that reason, to bring people like Black Panther people on the one hand, and a little later in history, people of Ethiopian background, to give them a kind of a startup year, a year at a pre-academic university, which would give them skills to get into university. So this is kind of one of the situations which existed. There are scholarships which exist for underprivileged groups in this country. So all those kind of things do exist. It's different from, obviously from what you're saying about the reparations idea, but there is definitely an understanding that certain groups in this country have to be helped more than others. And I think one sees it, by the way, if we take something we haven't discussed even for one sentence, if we take the Israeli-Arab situation, we see that they have a considerable number of doctors, and they were helped in the system. That means there were mechanisms which enabled them to go through medical training. And so I think there's kind of an awareness. I think we've also, to be honest, got budgetary challenges. High military costs in this country. And so although we're kind of theoretically a startup nation, only about 30% of the country are in the startup mode. The rest are just regular people. So, I think this is also part of the issue why not enough help has been existed. On the other hand, I must always say, one of the remarkable components about Israel are the NGOs, the third sector. To so many of, I can't tell you, so much so that many years ago, I was asked by one of the big sponsors in Israel to analyze what's going on in the third sector. And we found that in the city of Netanya, which is 15 minutes from where we drive, there were 3 organizations doing exactly the same thing within 10 minutes of each other, and they didn't know about each other. So it was NGOs in chaos. So this on the one hand, the chaos is not good. On the other hand, the fact that, there's a sense in Israel that we do as citizens have to go out of our way and try and help those people who are in less beneficial situations. And that gives a sense of optimism, I think.
Before we finish, I see lots of comments and questions about an interest in Ethiopian Jewish traditions, their Siddur, the Torah, and I think we'll do a program. How about we'll do a special program on Ethiopian traditions, I'll bring someone who
Yeah.
can focus on that.
It's a fascinating topic, and do bring an expert in. That'll be great.
But it is amazing. It is amazing that they are pre-rabbinic religion. So my last question is, in America, we have something called affirmative action, which gives a hand up to individuals who suffer discrimination. Does Israel have the concept of affirmative action?
It has it, but it's not a defined concept like you have in the United States. It's kind of the Israeli way of doing things, which is don't make everything too clear, but it just happens. So it's a kind of, we work in a different kind of way, but it exists. It exists in kind of, I would say, in an informal way. We're a different society from America. In my realm, I know if we had students who came from underprivileged backgrounds who didn't know Hebrew, I'll just give a case study for myself. If it was obvious that an Israeli-born student, that person's Hebrew was inadequate, I would often have an oral exam and not a written exam, because the person's writing would be terrible, but they could probably articulate what they knew orally in a better way. So that's kind of what we have in Israel, but it's not nearly on the kind of formalistic stated level that you have in the United States.
I told you it was one last question, but there's actually one more.
The police force. For the last
I know, but you are fascinating.
I'm happy. Don't worry.
I got you stuck. Where are you going to go? It's late. Evan, you're not going. So let's talk about the police force in America. We have this whole discussion about the police force and how to educate police officers to treat protesters in a different way, and also be better in their community, and also make sure the police force is more representative of their community. So my real last question is there an effort in Israel to make sure the police force has Ethiopians on it and has Mizrahi on it, or is the police force, dominated by a certain part of Israeli society?
No. By the way, there are a lot of Mizrahi police in the police force. The Mizrahi have actually got into the police force quite effectively. I don't know the exact figure of Mizrahi policemen, but I see them quite often. And by the way, the other section of Israeli society, the Arabs, there's a major project now. I think they're talking about trying to find at least 1,000 Arab citizens who will become police as well. And I mention the Arab because it's all part of a bigger picture of recognizing that the police have not done a good job in this country. They haven't been well informed. On one or two occasions, I've been asked to speak to the police about various social issues, and I was appalled by their lack of understanding. They'd grown up in a little bubble somewhere in Israeli society and had very, very little understanding of what was happening. So, you've got your American problem with the police. We've got our problem with the police as well. There's no doubt that there's some random violence which goes on. Lack of understanding, and this is certainly one of the realms where we have to develop our police force.
Well, I'm putting on the screen here so I can see everybody. Hold on. So I wanted to thank you for staying late. I wanted to thank you for talking about this very important subject. I enjoy and I appreciate Israel more when I understand the challenges that have gone into making a society. Israel is not a simple country. It is not one issue country. There is an issue that predominates, and that's all we read about in the news, and I understand that, and we all understand that. But it's a fascinating, beautiful country. It's a tapestry of different peoples. And because it's a tapestry, there's challenges. My hope is that by us learning about it, we appreciate Israel and also look into our own society, because we have similar challenges, and we learn from each other. And that hopefully Israelis will also learn about their own history, and that will lead to less discrimination, less challenges. So I want to thank you all for being with us on this very warm summer day. I'm going to spend quality time with my family here, and we'll see you all on Sunday when I'll be home. And thank you again, Paul, and everyone be safe. Take care.
Thank you very much. See you next week.
See you next week.